Hello. So in this video for Black History Month 2023, we're going to talk about Frantz Fanon's book, Black Skin, White Masks. This is one of the most important books of post-colonial theory. Frantz Fanon is one of the most important post-colonial theorists. And we're gonna talk about some of the interesting elements he brings in here, because essentially what he is doing in Black Skin, White Masks is trying to psychoanalyze colonized peoples, particularly Black colonized peoples. He himself was from Martinique in the Caribbean. He was of African ancestry. He was educated in France, and so he had that experience of growing up under French colonialism and being a colonized subject, but also going to metropolitan France and being educated there. He later went on to serve in the Algerian War for Independence, where he was a medic and a psychiatrist, essentially helping shell-shocked Algerian soldiers. And that actually was a big inspiration for his later book, The Wretched of the Earth, which is another foundational text in post-colonial theory. But Black Skin, White Masks comes out before the Algerian War for Independence breaks out. This is a book about the sort of double consciousness of colonized Black subjects. So this builds on the kind of ideas that W.E.B. Du Bois introduces in his book, The Souls of Black Folks. This idea of double consciousness, that there is a split within the African-American psyche in which one is never fully American, but also never fully foreign, never fully African. So there's always a feeling of disconnectedness. Fanon picks up on that idea, but he adds to it the lenses of his psychoanalytic training, particularly through Lacanian psychoanalysis and Sartrean existentialism. So there's an interesting interplay in this book of what we might call more direct or political post-colonial elements, this critique of the power structures of colonialism, alongside these psychoanalytic components and existential components that make the work somewhat deeper and more philosophically complex. Sort of like Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Decolonizing the Mind, which is very much about how the psyche of colonized subjects is built through the colonial education system. And indeed, Fanon does talk about the role of the colonial education system in shaping the minds of colonized people. So he says here, talking about the education system and one of the ways in which one tries to gain status in a colonized society. He says, all colonized people, in other words, people in whom an inferiority complex has taken root, whose local cultural originality has been committed to the grave, position themselves in relation to the civilizing language, i.e. the metropolitan culture. The more the colonized has assimilated the cultural values of the metropolis, the more he will have escaped the bush. The more he rejects his blackness and the bush, the whiter he will become. Then a little bit later, he says, among a group of young Antillians, he who can express himself, who masters the language, is the one to look out for. Be wary of him. He is almost white. In France, they say, to speak like a book. In Martinique, they say, to speak like a white man. So again, this is very much in the same vein as somebody like Ngugi, who talks about how education under British colonialism was a cultural bomb that destroyed the indigenous culture and that tried to erase from the person being educated what it meant to be part of their own culture. Fanon is dealing with a similar kind of concept here. But the thing that Fanon does that Ngugi is not as interested in is this question of what it means to encounter oneself through the other. What it means to encounter oneself as a colonized subject and to be made aware, based on one's skin color, that one is not the same. So this is again where the idea of double consciousness comes in. So he says here, when I meet a German or a Russian speaking bad French, I try to indicate through gestures the information he is asking for. But in doing so, I am careful not to forget that he has a language of his own, a country, and that perhaps he is a lawyer or an engineer back home. Whatever the case, he's a foreigner with different standards. There is nothing comparable when it comes to the black man. He has no culture, no civilization, and no long historical past. Perhaps that is why today's blacks want desperately to prove to the white world the existence of a black civilization. Whether he likes it or not, the black man has to wear the livery the white man has fabricated for him. And what Fanon means by that is that because colonialism and slavery erased so much of black culture, either in the Caribbean, in the Americas, on the continents, North and South America, where the culture of enslaved Africans was largely destroyed. Sometimes it blended into a multitude of traditions, mostly from West Africa, and you get things like voodoo, hoodoo, these different syncretic religions. But oftentimes culture was just destroyed. I mean, African American culture, even by the 1860s when slavery was abolished, had virtually no direct relationship, virtually no direct roots in the cultures of what's now Nigeria, Benin, Ghana, these places in West Africa where most of the ancestors of African American slaves were taken from. So this is part of the idea, is like, because black people especially in the Caribbean and in the Americas, because they have no distinct long culture, their culture is inherently shaped or informed by white conceptions, white stereotypes, and these cultural images constructed by white people of what black people are. And so this is one of the big things that Fanon is dealing with here, is this idea that as a colonized subject, you shape your own identity and your own psychology around the racist and culturally hierarchizing images created by the dominant metropolitan culture. And so rather than sort of self-generating a culture, generating a culture that is authentic and rooted in the best practices of your particular place and origins, you experience yourself through the lens of the other. And this is where sort of the Lacanian and the Sartrean elements come in. Because one of the things that that Fanon is very interested in is that black colonial subjects are created by their relation to whites, by their relation to the metropolitan center, but also in more directly sort of racial terms. So he says here, I am over-determined from the outside. I am a slave not to the idea others have of me, but to my appearance. I arrive slowly in the world. Sudden emergences are no longer my habit. I crawl along. The white gaze, the only valid one, is already dissecting me. I am fixed. Once their microtomes are sharpened, the whites objectively cut sections of my reality. I've been betrayed. I see in this white gaze that it's the arrival now of not of a new man, but of a new type of man, a new species, a Negro, in fact. And so this is very connected to Sartrean existentialism, because one of the things that Sartre talks about is the way that I am constructed by the gaze of the other. When the other looks at me, it reminds me on an existential level that the way others perceive me, the way I am perceived from the outside, differs from the way I perceive myself. And so being observed by the other invites me to externalize myself, externalize my idea of myself, to look at myself as though from the outside, and to see myself as though I am not myself. And this is essentially what Fanon is saying, but he's adding this dimension of race. So this is not just, by its very nature, I am abstracted from myself through the gaze of the other. This is, I am abstracted from myself and made aware of one distinct characteristic of myself. I am not just the other. I am the other with a difference. And that's more existentially traumatic, in a way. That's more detrimental, more alienating from the self than just to see oneself from the external perspective, to see oneself from the outside, to see oneself. What Fanon is arguing here is that to see oneself from the outside and to be reminded in that seeing of difference, for that gaze to say to you, not only are you other, but you are different other. You are not even the same type of other that I, the gazer, am. There is a further element of division from the self. And this is, of course, really important because it shapes the way, for Fanon, that colonized Black people can conceptualize themselves. This is, again, for Sartre, the way that we experience that abstraction from the self by experiencing the gaze of the other shapes the way we conceptualize ourselves. For Fanon, that is true, plus there is the additional element of the person being gazed at's experience of themselves is also racialized in a way that it's not for Sartre, in the way that Sartre doesn't particularly focus on. So it's he says here, and this is kind of the crucial defining element of Blackness for Fanon, is this idea of being defined in contrast to whiteness. So he says, ontology does not allow us to understand the being of the Black man since it ignores the lived experience. For not only must the Black man be Black, he must be Black in relation to the white man. Some people will argue that the situation has a double meaning. Not at all. The Black man has no ontological resistance in the eyes of the white man. From one day to the next, the Blacks have had to deal with two systems of reference. Their metaphysics, or less pretentiously, their customs and the agency to which they refer, were abolished because they were in contradiction with a new civilization that imposed its own. So the core element here is the erasure of the indigenous or native culture of West Africans, particularly those brought over during the slave trade, and instead the imposition all Africans, really, because the African colonization eventually spread across the entirety of Africa. But cultural erasure was most successful with those brought to the Western Hemisphere through colonialism and through the slave trade. But the abolition of the native culture of the people brought as slaves, combined with the sort of replacing of that culture with the metropolitan culture, whether that was French culture, as in the case of Fanon, British culture, as in the case of slavery in what became the United States and in some other colonies like Jamaica, places like this, whether that was Spanish culture, Portuguese culture, whatever it was. The erasure of one's own culture and the replacement with a foreign culture is psychologically destructive. It destroys one's identity. It makes one a foreigner to oneself. And this is the thing that Fanon is most interested in, is the detrimental psychological effects of that experience.